fellow. No need to remember when, 'cause everything old is new again. Dancing at your Long Island Jazz Age parties. Waiter, bring some more Bacardis. We'll order now what they ordered then, 'cause everything old is new again. Get out your white suit, your tap shoes and tails. Let's go backwards when forward fails. And movie stars you thought were long dead now are framed beside your bed. Don't throw the past away. You might need it some rainy day. Dreams can come true again.
Welcome. I'm Libby Motika, your host and moderator for tonight's program. After watching the opening video, you probably now have a pretty good idea of the subject for tonight's program. Part of the Santa Monica Conservancy's 20th anniversary celebration, our program on adaptive reuse will explore this form of historic preservation and present specific examples of representative projects in Santa Monica. In repurposing an existing structure for a new use, adaptive reuse breathes new life into historic buildings, often into something useful for the community, like low-income housing, community centers, or mixed-use creative venues. Architect Mario Fonda-Bonardi will begin the program explaining adaptive reuse, how it works, and why it is an excellent idea for many building projects. The next part of the program will focus on the existing AR properties in Santa Monica. We'll then spend some time reviewing other AR projects of the many that exist in the city. The program will conclude with perhaps the most challenging project. Designed by Gehry, the plans call for repositioning two historic properties on Ocean Avenue and adding a hotel and rental units. The program will conclude as usual with a Q&A session that you may participate in by using your Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to also encourage you to ask questions along the way as they occur to you, so that we can look at them at the end. Now I'd like to welcome Mario Fonda-Bonardi, a partner with Bernardi Holman Architects, specializing in architectural engineering. He also sits on the Santa Monica City Planning Commission and is a member of the Santa Monica Board of Directors.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Libby. And let's start talking about adaptive reuse. Just like your body, the urban fabric is continually renewing itself. Buildings are continuously torn down and new ones erected in their place. But some parts of your body, such as adult teeth, need to last a lifetime. Likewise, certain buildings should last the lifetime of a city. These significant buildings play an outsized role in the city's history. They usually get landmarked and are afforded the highest level of protection. Santa Monica, a city of about 50,000 structures, has only about 150 landmarks. If these structures were evenly distributed in the city's 147-year history, there would be less than one landmark-worthy structure built every year. It's fun to guess which of these buildings being built today will be the landmarks of tomorrow. But there's another, more common and efficient way the urban fabric renews itself, and that is to take existing buildings with a minor modification and repurpose them for new uses, avoiding their outright demolition and preserving their presence in the community. This adaptive reuse provides benefits that are shared by residents and developers alike. First, the greenest building is the one not torn down. Some estimates say that construction waste accounts for 40% of our landfills. Every time a building is demolished, it inevitably creates an irreducible amount of waste that cannot be recycled. And this waste accumulates, filling up our landfills. More importantly, every building has also what's called embedded energy in it, which is the energy needed to harvest lumber, to fabricate components, bring the workers and materials to the job site, power the cranes, the excavators, et cetera, et cetera. When a building is completely torn down, all that embedded energy is completely wasted, goes into the atmosphere as global warming greenhouse gas with no ongoing benefit and considerable penalty to future generations. Conversely, when a building is adaptively reused, much of that embedded energy remains in the building itself to benefit future generations. In the life of a typical building, about half the energy goes into the actual construction. That's the embedded energy portion, while the other half goes to operate the building for, say, the first 30 years of its life. As all our buildings become more efficient, the embedded energy becomes a larger fraction of the total energy cost of a building. Therefore, saving that embedded energy is vital to meeting our global warming goals. Secondly, adaptively reused buildings are quicker to complete. This is a no-brainer. Adaptively reusing a building is quicker than building new, particularly since large new buildings often have to provide full subterranean parking with the attendant delays and neighborhood disruption of excavation and so on. Finally, adaptively reused building can become an opportunity to solve chronic or crisis problems far quicker than new construction. For example, if you consider the acres of empty office buildings today because so many of the information workers are working from home and are likely to stay there. So all that appropriate office space could be right for conversion to housing, some of it, not all of it. As a secondary benefit, such conversion often does not displace residents or businesses, since those buildings are probably already empty and are often have abundant parking or are near transit hubs. So when construction moves quickly, both the developer and residents benefit. Third, the adaptive reuse is typically cheaper than new construction. Obviously, older buildings can typically be repurposed for less than costs starting from scratch. Since the shell of an adaptively reused building remains intact, its expense whose replacement is avoided. Often this remodeling is very labor intensive and may actually create more skilled jobs per square foot than new construction. On large adaptive reuse projects, the cost savings can be upwards of 20% compared to new construction. Finally, adaptively reused buildings have more fans than new buildings. Buildings are not just time, money, square feet. There's always an emotional component. Perhaps this building is your first preschool, or where you had your bar mitzvah, where you went on your first date with your wife, where a memorial was held for a beloved relative. I'm sure all of you can think of a building that has special meaning for you. Because those are familiar older buildings, they have accumulated layers and layers of personal and collective stories. And the people who have those stories often remember those buildings in a very favorable light, even when they may have changed appearance over the decades. People who have used them still remember them in their previous incarnation. This long familiarity beats an extra dimension of charm for a current experience of them. It takes a long time for a new building to accumulate all these stories and positive associations, while an adaptively reused building could start with a 30, 50, or 70-year head start in its affinity. More people will fight to preserve an older, threatened building with demolition than a new one. People like new buildings, but they love old buildings. But the opposite is also true. When familiar buildings are demolished, all those memories vanish. Imagine any building with affection, and say a home you grew up in, and now imagine that building is gone, replaced with some anonymous econobox. That disoriented feeling you are experiencing in this thought experiment is urban amnesia. It's an impoverished city whose residents can't remember where they've been or even where they are. Fortunately, Santa Monica has many different adaptively reused buildings, which we will be highlighting later in the show. The biggest collection of adaptively reused buildings in the city is in the buildings in the 3rd Street Promenade and the surrounding downtown areas. These older buildings remain a part of the living family of buildings that make up our city such an interesting place. They exemplify the magic of adaptive reuse. Is every building worthy of adaptive reuse? Of course not. For the best candidates, we could start with the 1,500 buildings in the city's historic resource inventory list. These buildings have substantial architectural or historical merit, and they deserve special attention but will probably never rise to the level of being protected by landmarking. They could still be protected by adaptive reuse. The city would do well to establish a policy incentivizing the adaptive reuse of existing buildings. Small incentives are often enough to keep a building from being demolished and help it survive by adaptive reuse. Even the preservation of a small number of adaptively rebuilding is of tremendous benefit to the architectural experience and, more importantly, to the soul of our city. Back to you, Libby.
Thank you. Thank you, Mari, for that good introduction to AR. Now, perhaps one of the most unusual repurposing projects is a World War II Quonset hut on 9th and Broadway in Santa Monica that now serves as the Pono Burger restaurant. John Arnold, a partner of KFA Architecture, was the lead architect of the project, which also includes adjacent multifamily housing. John holds a BS in environmental design and an MA in architecture. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Libby. Okay, welcome everybody. Good evening. My name is John Arnold with KFA Architecture, and we're in Culver City. Today, I'm actually going to talk about two projects, both of which you wouldn't necessarily see as historic, or even you might even not even recognize them. So the first is the Quonset hut that is located at the corner of 9th and Broadway. Next slide, please. So Quonset huts have a very brief history. It's 1941, before the United States was drawn into World War II. The U.S. military commissioned the Fuller Steel Company and a steel company called Strand Steel to develop an easily moved, easily disassembled military building, a hut that it could be moved around the world, that they could create military bases really quickly. And they asked them to do this at Quonset Point, Rhode Island. That's where the name came from. And they had two criteria: one, easily removed, easily put together, just like IKEA furniture. And the other one, they wanted an arced dome of a roof, both for strength and also, believe it or not, to deflect shrapnel and bombs. So if anything fell around it, it would bounce off. It went through several iterations through 1941. It started in the spring of 1941. And the first iteration was a perfect arc. The second iteration was this one, which was appropriately called redesign. And this is the one that we have in Santa Monica. The redesign took the arc, raised it up on short walls. And this is the one that we have. And you can see it's a segmented arch built of basically Tinker Toys with little I-beams that are made of little steel channels. The lower left slide, you can see it's corrugated metal siding. There's a wall panel inside and some insulation. And then the final product. Next slide, please. Strandcore did two innovative things to get this to work for the U.S. military. One was that the double deformation of the roof panels. So if you can imagine taking a piece of paper, a piece of sheet metal, folding it into an accordion, and then trying to bend it in the long direction. You just can't do it. So they figured out a way to double deform steel so they could use it as this arced roof that also shed water down the grooves of the corrugation. Apparently this machine made tons of noise as metal was thrust through this double deforming mechanism, but it worked. And that was one of the things that Strandcore did that was innovative. The second thing is really interesting is this vertical joint in the middle of the drawing. It's that little squiggle. That was a deformation in the I-beam. So you could drive a nail into that deformation. The nail would stick in, but if you pulled on it hard enough, you could pull it back out. So that way they could take apart the Quonset huts and move them around as they needed. Next slide, please. So Quonset huts were, throughout World War II, the US military fabricated 153,000 Quonset huts, of which about 25,000 was that redesign model with the two walls. This is the third iteration of the Quonset hut. I think this is in the United States being shipped overseas. They went up to Alaska, went to the Pacific Theater, and they also, a lot of army bases in the United States were made of Quonset huts. Next slide, please. This is one being put together. This is the redesign model with the wall panels you see here. Next slide, please. This is a Quonset village somewhere in the United States. Most of this, what you see is housing. You can tell that from the windows that are punched in the side. The larger ones at the right, they use them for everything. Next slide, please. This is a Quonset village in San Pedro, so nearby. So Quonset huts, the military, the Southern California was an active military area for the Western Hemisphere, or for the Pacific Theater. Next slide, please. And they indeed use them for everything, here for administration. Next slide. For barracks, this one is in Alaska, and I like to think they're using the pinups for a little extra insulation with the wall panels. Next slide, please. They use them for housing a lot. This is a military housing on a military base, so families had places to live. Next slide, please. After World War II is a different story. Strandcorp was interested in not going out of business. They wanted to keep producing Quonset huts. Their vision was that everything that was going to be built in the United States after World War II was going to be a Quonset hut. Didn't quite turn out that way. They maybe sold a few new ones for agriculture, but people didn't really like them because they made a lot of noise when the sun hit them with the expansion. But the U.S. military had a lot of surplus. So they made 153,000. A lot of them ended up in surplus, and they sold them for $1,000 a piece. And they ended up all over the United States after the war to really restart the economy, both with, next slide, please, turned into housing. Next slide. This, you might be familiar with this scene. This is a commercial building. As businesses tried to restart, there wasn't a lot of materials to build new buildings, so they bought a Quonset hut for $1,000, and up goes a hardware store. And so next slide, please. And later, Strand Steel, I don't know what happened with them, but they stopped making Quonset huts. So what we're used to seeing in our urban environment is a blighted Quonset hut. They ran out of parts, they got rusty, they basically turned into metal sheds in our urban environment. And that's what happened to the one in Santa Monica. Next slide, please. And these are two in New York City of the redesign. Next slide, please. A lot of them ended up in Alaska. Alaska became a state after World War II, and to get their infrastructure going, many Quonset huts are in Alaska, and today it's the state that has the most of them. Next slide, please. So fast forward to 2007, Santa Monica. These are the Quonset huts as they existed on the site before the project. There were two Quonset huts here. There's the left one, which is the landmarked one, which is the redesign with the short walls. And then there was a arc one that was really heavily modified. It was chopped up, it was shortened, it removed walls. That one was not landmarked. So when the developer bought these three parcels, as all of us were driven by saying there's nothing here worthy of landmarking, they went to pull the demo permit, and someone in the community said, hey, wait a minute, this might be historic. And indeed, the city went through the historic designation process, and the Landmarks Commission designated the left building as a landmark. Next slide. This is the back side. The landmark one is at the rear. It was built in 1946 out of surplus, and it was a hardware store. You can see the word hardware etched in the rust there. And the one in front of us was not landmarked. Next slide, please. This is the interior. It was in pretty good shape. The wall panels inside were gone, and you can see how they patched on the other Quonset hut to the left. And this is the one we preserved. Next slide, please. Rather than fight City Hall, fight the community, we got together with the developer, and we decided that this Quonset hut, as humble as it was full of character. It wasn't that big. It was only 400 square feet, and we decided to integrate it into the project. The good thing about Quonset huts is they're meant to be taken apart. So we were able to take it apart, store it off-site at a very secure place that everyone knew about, so it wouldn't get lost with time. So we took it apart, put it into storage, and we built the project. Next slide, please. And you see, one back. Up, backwards. Okay, now we're going. There we go. Thank you. Up. So the Quonset hut we located at the corner. It used to be more inboard of the site, but because they're mobile, the site was not landmarked, only the building itself. So you can see it doesn't take up that much of a footprint, but it's right there on the corner of 9th and Broadway. So we really want it to be a highlight of the project. Next slide, please. When we designed, sorry, back one. Okay, okay, next slide, please. I think we skipped one. So this is the Quonset hut in location. At the corner, you can see it in all its rusting glory. Quonset huts were originally painted, but we had an option to paint it or not. We liked it better without the paint. We thought it was a little funkier to be on this back corner of Santa Monica off of Lincoln. We thought it matched a little bit better. Next slide, please. When designing the Quonset hut, we actually had a little exercise of what's the Quonset hut's natural habitat. We thought it was always in a field, maybe it was a military base, maybe it was on an island in the Pacific, San Pedro or wherever, but it was always in a fresh green field. So that's where our jumping off point was to design the new building. Next slide, please. We put together this really quick conceptual drawing of a Quonset hut pasted into a green field. And next slide. So we designed the building to be striated with green fields of wheat or crops or grass or mowed fields with some other greenery. And we really wanted to place the Quonset hut in a place very front forward that was evocative of where it was naturally, where it was originally in the military. We also styled the landscape to be very grassy, like a sand dune, much like a field. Next slide, please. This is the Quonset hut being reconstructed, new foundation per code, all bolted together just like the military intended, all taken out of storage. Next slide, please. You can see the pieces here, that double deformed corrugated metal. The good thing about having the other Quonset hut that was not landmarked is we could use it for spare parts. Well, some of the landmark Quonset hut was damaged, so we could use the other one to pull pieces off of and replace things. So it was really a very handy resource. Next slide, please. And this is the final view right after it was finished construction with the Quonset hut at the corner. Really lucky to get Pono Burger, that they had this Hawaiian, there were lots of Quonset huts in Hawaii, so it really has this funky beach feel. Next slide, please. Went to the Landmarks Commission to ask if we could put windows on the side. They allowed us to do that. It made the adaptive reuse viable, so the building wouldn't be hot and dark inside. We really spent a lot of time on the ends to make a really practical, useful end piece that really matched this really practical architecture of the Quonset hut. Next slide, please. There's Pono Burger with his grassy landscape, using it for their dining room. Next slide, please. And on the interior, the contractor really did a good job to recreate what was originally masonite wall panels and this really wood, this modulated, this segmented wood paneling in the ceiling with also insulation, of course, modern HVAC and sprinklers to code. Next slide, please. And this is our prime marketing shot showing it in full action, being used as a dining room with a new building with the vines crawling up on the screen beyond. And that's the Quonset hut. Next, I'm going to talk for half a minute on our next project, which is on Michigan Avenue at 14th. Another building you would have noticed was historic, but it is historic. It was a community hall built in the late 50s, very simple stucco building built for the Japanese community that remained in Santa Monica after World War II. They built it as a community room, very simple stucco structure, and it was empty as it's empty today, bought by a developer, and we basically used the same approach. Next slide, please. To incorporate it into the design of 100% affordable multifamily housing. So really using it as a highlight to give some breathing space to the building, the new building, and really use as an open space. It's going to be used as a community room again for the new project. So look for this to be coming online. It's under construction now at 14th and Michigan. And thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
The history of Quonset in 10 minutes. Thanks so much. Our next segment features the Proper Hotel, the 1928 Spanish Renaissance building and modern addition at the corner of 7th and Wilshire. Under the direction of project architect Howard Lax and historic architect Robert Chattel, the building was transformed from a professional building to a hotel and joined by new construction to the south. Howard Lax is the principal of the Santa Monica-based Howard Lax Architecture, recognized for numerous and award-winning commercial and residential projects in Santa Monica. Robert Chattel is president of historic preservation firm Chattel Incorporated, specializing in applying the Secretary of Interior standards for treatment of historic properties. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Libby. I will start off the presentation by looking at really, as the architect for the Proper Hotel, my role was to do and design as the executive architect and design architect, in addition to the existing building. Robert Chattel project historic preservation architect will present the opportunities and challenges during the rehabilitation of a landmark structure. This was a joint effort with Robert and myself for an adaptive reuse project. Again, everything old is new again. Next. Okay, the Santa Monica Proper Hotel combines rehabilitation and adaptive reuse of a 1928 Spanish colonial revival landmark building with a new contextual infill characterized by curvature forms of concrete and glass. Next. Okay. The Santa Monica Professional Building was designed by Arthur E. Harvey and built in 1928. It was designated as a local landmark by the Santa Monica Landmarks Commission in 2005. The work was implemented under a 2012 development agreement and was reviewed and approved by a unique form joint design review board called the JDRB, consisting of 4 landmarks commissioners and 3 architectural review board members. A building permit was issued in 2015. We started construction in 2017. The work was completed in 2019. Next. Okay. So as mentioned, our role in the project was the addition to the landmark building. However, when you're doing an adaptive reuse project, or in this case, an infill to the adaptive reuse, we also have to comply to the Secretary of Interior standards. There's 2 conditions or findings that need to be made for an addition to tie into the rehab building. The new work should be differentiated from the old and shall be compatible with the massing, size, scale, and architectural features to protect the historic integrity of the property and its environment. New construction shall be undertaken in such a manner that if the addition is removed in the future, the essential form and integrity of the historic property and its environment would be unimpaired. Next. Between 2005 and 2014, there was a number of models that we designed for the addition. The addition on the right side, obviously the landmark on the left. And as we work through the community, that is planning staff, members of the community, the JDRB, Planning Commission, City Council, the project evolved and additional study models were prepared. This was not compatible because it did not comply with the building height of the landmark, building mass, or form. Next. As we received more comments from the community and from planning staff, we started to carve the building with respect to creating a 2nd floor podium deck similar to the landmark building to the left. And also we began to reduce the size of the massing, the wings, more compatible to the landmark building, as you see with the green arrows. Next. Okay. As we continue doing study models, we began to match the angled form of the landmark building. We started to match proportions of the landmark building. And we also started to look very closely at the spatial arrangement between the addition and the landmark building. And the only thing connecting the 2 buildings, the landmark to the addition, is one single pedestrian bridge at the 2nd floor. If you notice the 18 feet, that gave some breathing room between the addition and the landmark building. And then the image of 21 feet to the upper right, we started to move the addition back. So when you're driving on the boulevard, you can see the landmark building from the street level. Next. Architectural features and fenestration is also a very important part of complying to the Secretary standards. We looked very closely at the fenestration of the addition. We began to study the landmark building, the proportions, the openings, the punch outs, the solid walls, and we came up with a contemporary interpretation of the landmark building. Next. As we continued through the process, we now looked at the geometry and the form of the landmark building, and I took the geometries you see in the lower left, and I started to move it around the addition. So that way we can start to play with the proportions. and provide a series of unique freeform wings of similar scale and proportions for compatibility. Next. As we went through all the different entitlements and discretionary reviews, the building really began to play off the landmark building with respect to building height and massing, scale, proportions, contemporary interpretation of architectural features, and respect to the space between the landmark building and the new building. Plus, it gave us a lot of great, wonderful street level open space. At this time, I'd like to bring in Robert Chattel to talk about the rehabilitation of the landmark building. Thanks, Robert.
Thanks, Howard. Next slide. So some detail on the landmark building rehabilitation. This is the front entrance on Wilshire Boulevard. It's also showing the lobby marble floor. One of the key aspects of work in Santa Monica is that interiors are not typically designated. So we strive to retain much of the original character where it existed here. So a significant amount of seismic retrofit was undertaken, as you'll see, and we very much focused on the waste mold and cast stone concrete elements. Next. So among those waste mold elements, the building had been overpainted for many years. We decided to retain much of the paint on the surface of the building. It has plateresque, a form of churrigueresque architectural elements. We found one of the smaller finials that you see on the bottom left, and we fabricated from photographs and drawings the larger finial seen on the right. These were fabricated by Moonlight Molds. Next. On the south elevation of the building, where there was originally single-family residences adjacent to the professional building in the late 1920s, we opened up 3 new large openings. This was originally an ambulance bay. The professional building housed medical offices and attorneys' offices as a condominium. So this single lane ambulance bay, about 8 feet wide, was originally to serve that medical office function. Next. A significant amount of seismic retrofit was undertaken. Adjacent unreinforced masonry building was demolished along Wilshire Boulevard, and you can see what was uncovered of the reinforced concrete podium level of the landmark building. We put Humpty Dumpty back together again with a significant amount of new concrete and steel. You can see in the slide on the right that there are through bolt anchors with round washers. So that was part of the seismic retrofit. Next. We also used a significant amount of fiber reinforced polymer. This is almost like a wallpaper. It's a netting, it's a form of netting that helps structurally strengthen the building. The upper floor of the building above the podium is Y in shape, as Howard described, and it's particularly challenging from a structural standpoint. So we used quite a bit of this FRP for walls, ceilings, floors, the roof. Next. The interior walls and the enclosure on this oval shaped stair were all hollow clay tile and archaic building material. We chose to remove all of it and to reconstruct the walls around the oval shaped stair. The stair itself is cast iron. It's hung from the structure. This was one particularly challenging aspect of the project because the egress doors on this stair open into the corridor. These are new doors that we added. The stair was originally open to the corridor. Before we even filed for a building permit, we filed an appeal, and we were successful in our second round of an appeal with the building official using the California Historical Building Code to allow this stair to exist. And that's principally because we added a second code compliance stair, and we added a full automatic sprinkler system. Next. One of the elements that we accurately reconstructed, we retained a large portion of the center of the lobby floor. And then we reconstructed at either end where we had to place new footings for reinforced concrete shear walls. We matched the marble very closely. The gray marble, for example, is called Napoleon, and it's from France. Next. We also retained the original steel sash windows, and this was a particular challenge. The steel sash windows were single strength glass, not waterproof, and we couldn't make them so. So we added an interior stainless steel gutter at the window and a secondary window, a quiet window on the interior. So we addressed both the waterproofing issues and acoustics by adding an interior window. Next. Howard mentioned the bridge. These are two images of the bridge looking towards the landmark building and looking from the landmark building on the right to the new construction. The bridge next really just kisses the two buildings. There's significant connections at the basement for housekeeping and utilities and so forth, infrastructure, but only the bridge is what connects the two buildings on the upper floors. Next. And the buildings, as Howard described, contrast one another, but are complementary. Next. And a shout out to the property owner who is Alex Gorby. He partnered with Core Group to implement this project. He and his brother owned the property, started assembling the site in the 1970s, and he was the consummate leader of this effort to see the historic building preserved and integrated into a new hotel. Back to Libby.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Howard. And now Mario returns to give a brief tour of an early 20th century shotgun house that now serves as the Santa Monica Conservancy's Preservation Resource Center. This 1 room wide, 4 rooms deep cottage is over 100 years old, built between 1895 and 1902. Mario, welcome back.
Thank you, Libby. We'll get started here in a second. There we go. I hope you can see it. This is the shotgun house. And this is obviously a very small building. It's only 12 feet wide. It's really a cousin of the Quonset hut. If you think about it, it lives in the same grassy area as the Quonset hut. And it is basically a building that has a long pedigree of buildings that are built by people. In other words, they are things like Quonset huts are not built by people, but log cabins are, adobes are, sod houses. These are all historical buildings, usually built by people who need housing fast. If you have a mining camp and miners need housing because there's a big strike here, or a lumber camp, or a railroad camp, or farming when you need housing for workers and seasonal workers that come in, they need housing while they're harvesting. You would build a shotgun house. And these shotgun houses are very simply built. They just have 12-inch planks. There are the walls. There are no studs. And then there's little strips of wood on the outside. They're called battens that you can see here in the building's facade that close up the seams between the vertical planks. The rest of the building, though, because it was built in 1897, is a very Victorian building. It has ornate woodwork, it has nice shingling at the top, it has fluted railings for the white picket fence around the outside. And so even though it's so simple and sort of almost a working housing, like we would call it workforce housing today, it still comes with a Victorian sensibility. If we go inside, and we're going to use these big black circles as a way of moving around in the model. This is what you see as soon as you walk in the front door. And what you'll notice is that all the doors are lined up because this particular form of architecture comes from the South about 2 centuries ago. It came in at New Orleans and then went up the Mississippi River and then went up the Ohio Valley. And then it went viral. It went all over the US where there's wood. Because the wood is very thin here, only an inch, it doesn't do very well in places that it's cold. You would not find this in Alaska or Minnesota. But in the South, in the Southwest, you definitely find shotgun houses. You also find them as cabins, which are seasonal cabins, meaning just for the summer. One thing about our building, though, you'll notice is that the opening of all these doors was about ventilation, because the idea was to move air through without the benefit of fans, without the benefit of air conditioning, because these buildings all came before the advent of commonly distributed electricity. The other thing you'll notice is the light level is very good in these buildings. They were designed to operate during the daytime without any artificial light. And even though they're very small, this whole building is only 525 square feet, it is the kind of building that, if you think about it, is really a nice, comfortable size for a very tight family. A family that maybe has, even if they're raising children, we're going to walk all the way to the back here, and we're going to turn around and meet the person who used to live in this building. And she came by, and here she is in the mid-60s, graduating, Karen Noonan, graduating from high school, actually, Santa Monica High School. And here she is with her family, her brother and her dad and her uncle. And here she is again. I know these are very small. You can barely see, but here she is as maybe a 12-year-old girl. And when we rehabbed this building and it was placed there, someone sent her a newspaper article about it. And she came back from Arizona and said, "What have you done to my building?" And she gave us these photographs that are priceless, basically historical documents of the building actually being used. And how was it being used? Well, the middle room here, this room here, which is now the director's office, that's where her brother and her dad slept. In the next room over here, the middle room, this room here, is where her mom and she slept. And then the front room was the living room. And this pop out here that you see, which is original, was where probably a fold down bed was provided there. So the house, because it was so small, had to be used very efficiently. You'll also notice here, this wall right here has a crack in it because this wall is designed to move, it hinged. And so we're preserving that idea that all the doors line up, but when we have bigger meetings or classrooms, we swing that wall open and we can use the full first 2 rooms of the house. The other thing you'll notice here in adaptive reuse, we have introduced these 2 very discrete steel columns here, which provide structural reinforcement to the front of the building. And then you'll also include, if you look up here, you'll see also a fire sprinkler here. And if you look at our walls here, you'll see these are the original boards that make up the outer wall of the building. And on the inside, you would have wallpaper. And then this actual build out here, the white wall, is the new wall. And that is because this building is not insulated originally. Over time, people wanted wiring, they wanted plumbing, they wanted insulation, and all these things had to be added. So what was a very small building, for comfort reasons, got even smaller. But even though the building is very small, it is still a LEED Gold certified building, which means it has a very high rating for energy efficiency and ecological performance. And this was achieved through super insulation, and our garden outside, which you see here, is all native landscaping and requires very little water. None of our plywood has formaldehyde. None of our fabrics have various plastic poisons. It's a very healthy and very low energy building. And so when you think about all the things that are new, well, you know, think about Airbnb. It sounds really new. Well, Santa Monica's first shotgun houses appeared on the beach as rentals. They were owners who could rent their beach homes out to people, and then they might come during the winter or even during the fall or springs and use their home as their own weekend getaway. You hear a lot about prefab construction now. Well, you could buy 100 years ago, you could buy a kit for a shotgun house and you and your cousins put it together. You hear a lot about small buildings. Yeah, now the tiny house movement is very popular. Well, this was the original tiny house. This is what it looked like. And finally, you know, these buildings like the Quonset are mobile. So, you know, if you needed housing fast today, you call up FEMA and they send you a trailer. Well, this is the trailer of 100 years ago. If you needed a house fast, you built a shotgun house. And if you needed to move the shotgun house, you could move it because it was very small. It can be dragged by horses. And in fact, our shotgun house has been moved 3 times before it's found a permanent home here. And the last thing I'd like to add is the idea of embedded energy. Today's buildings take a lot of steel and concrete, uses up a lot of power to make it. This building is almost entirely wood. It now has real foundations, but when it was built, did not have anything except wood as its material. The biggest piece was 3.5-inch square, and it was all done by hand tools. It could all be cut by hand tools, except at a certain point, the Industrial Revolution allowed us to do this nice fluting here that was done by basically a machine, but basically the building itself was all assembled by hand. So again, that's when we say everything that's old becomes new again, and this is what it looks like. And what it tells you, you can take a building from the 19th century and push it into the 21st century and give it another 100 years of life. Thank you. Back to you, Libby.
Boy, that's fascinating. Thank you very much, Mauro. This looks great, and what a neat virtual tour. Besides the projects featured on tonight's program, there are many notable reuse projects in Santa Monica. Santa Monica Conservancy board member Ruthann Lehrer provides snapshots of some of them. A recognized preservationist, Ruthann is a former member of the city's Landmark Commission and is currently co-chair of the Santa Monica Conservancy's Advocacy Committee. Ruthann, it's your platform.
Thanks, Libby. Welcome, everyone. Let's start the tour. So this is where adaptive reuse emerged in Santa Monica. The Rap Saloon was one of our most famous historic and abandoned buildings. It was built as a beer hall in 1875 by William Rapp, the year the city was founded, and was the city's first brick building. In 1888, it became Santa Monica's town hall for a period of 10 months. Over the years, many different users moved through it. Storage for the Vitagraph studio, an early film company, a Salvation Army meeting hall, a radiator repair shop, art galleries. The exterior remained relatively intact into the 1980s, except for the garage door installed for auto repairs. Ken Genzer, a beloved former city councilman, was the person who reset its future. Mr. Genzer then worked for American Youth Hostels and thought that this facility could use the Rap Saloon as the centerpiece for the new youth hostel in downtown Santa Monica. The building was landmarked, and the new project incorporated the entire building into this new use so that the hostel wrapped around it. The interior was renovated for a community room. The hostel is now known as Hosteling International and will be adding additional housing accommodations as it's been hugely successful. The Rap Saloon is receiving a new restoration renovation now, spearheaded by Conservancy board member and preservation architect David Kaplan. Next. The preservation and relocation of the first Roy Jones house was the city's first foray into historic preservation, with City Council playing the lead role. This stately home was originally located on Ocean and Washington Avenues, a site destined for a multifamily housing project. Roy Jones was the son of city co-founder John P. Jones and a civic leader. His house was designed by eminent architect Sumner P. Hunt in the colonial revival style. 2 city council women, Chris Reed and Chloe Hoover, took the lead in initiating its relocation to a city-owned site at Main Street and Ocean Park Boulevard, where it was restored and transformed inside into a museum. The adaptive reuse of historic homes into house museums is a common scenario in the U.S., but the broader function of this one as the California Heritage Museum with changing exhibits makes it distinctive. Next. Next slide. Oh, there we go. Few adaptive reuse projects are such an amazing transformation as this one. The Evening Outlook building was constructed for our hometown newspaper by renowned architect John Parkinson. It's a relatively modest building, but chose his design penchant for classical balance and fine detailing. The Outlook outgrew the building and moved into a larger space, and it was then taken over by a church in 1954. This was an adaptive reuse before the term adaptive reuse had even been invented. St. Peter and St. Paul Coptic Church came in subsequently and have transformed the interior into a dazzling environment for Eastern Orthodox services. One is almost blinded by the ornamental richness of icons in the gold altar screen. The building was featured on a conservancy tour called Sacred Spaces, presented a few years ago, and they were most welcoming to us. Interestingly, the original semi-industrial function of the newspaper building has been preserved in retaining the original industrial windows on the side elevations. The original facade has been preserved, but step inside and you have entered a new world. Next. A celebrated funeral home and mortuary transformed into Tartine's Bakery and Cafe. From death to new life. This imaginative adaptive reuse retained the Tudor Revival architectural features on the exterior, even restoring the intricate windows. But the interior is contemporary, filled with light for a very popular trendy cafe. They've wisely retained the open landscape at the corner of 20th and Arizona, which provides for public seating. Tartine's received a Preservation Award for Adaptive Reuse from the Conservancy in 2022. Next. The Mar Vista Apartments were a rare survivor in the Central Business District on 2nd Street and Broadway, used for rental housing. Built in 1914, its Renaissance Revival design has intricate brickwork and decorative details. Two masses are separated by a narrow courtyard with a classical doorway to mark the entrance. Ghost signage survived on the rear facade proclaiming steam heat. As our downtown evolved over the years, the Mar Vista remained an enclave for affordable housing, but the building showed long-term neglect and deterioration. It was purchased and converted into office use a few years ago, an adaptive reuse that required considerable rehabilitation and restoration. The exterior architectural features have been carefully restored. The building received seismic and infrastructure upgrades, and new landscape and lighting installed. The project received a Preservation Award from the Conservancy in 2021. Next. Our WPA-era main post office was one of the city's most beloved buildings, as was evident from the huge public outcry that came from residents when the federal government decided to close and sell the building. But sell they did, only after the city enacted preservation covenants to protect the building's distinctive period architectural style inside and out, including the beautiful redwood lobby. The building was then sold to a media company, which proceeded to open up interior spaces and to expose material elements such as butcher block floors. That company then decided that they needed larger space, so they moved on and sold the building to investors hoping to bring in creative office uses. Then, boom, came the pandemic, halting business activity and putting the brakes on finding the right tenant. Fortunately, through all these changes, those responsible for the building have relied on the historic preservation expertise of Robert Chattel, who we've met tonight. So we can call this a pending adaptive reuse, waiting for the right party to move in and fully revive our cherished post office. Next. The landmark Sears building is in a similar moment. The building was purchased for conversion into creative uses, office uses, and a food court, all put on hold due to the pandemic shutdowns. The interiors have already been opened up and are waiting for new businesses to put the building fully back into service. And so adaptive reuse continues to be a critical tool for the city's historic preservation program, where our historic places become the springboard for economic and cultural revitalization. Thank you. Back to you, Libby.
Thank you, Ruthann. That was a good tour of some of the other projects that we haven't fully focused on tonight. And now Robert Chattel rejoins us to discuss the Gehry Architects Ocean Avenue project on Ocean at Santa Monica Boulevard. Ambitious in scope, the plans call for a hotel, apartments, and incorporate 2 Ocean Avenue historic buildings. Robert, tell us about this new project, please.
Thank you, Libby. So approved earlier this year by the City Council unanimously, which in my years in working in Santa Monica, that is, I can tell you, the first time I've seen a project of this kind approved unanimously. Similar to the Santa Monica proper hotel, this new project is the subject of a development agreement, and an environmental impact report was prepared for it. It involves the retention, relocation, and repurposing of 2 designated landmark buildings on Ocean Avenue, the construction of a 130-foot tall, which is the city's maximum high-rise that will serve as an approximately 120-room hotel, and approximately 100 apartments, some of which are replacement housing, others are covenanted as affordable. So a mixed use project, if you will. Next slide. As you might imagine, much of our work starts with research, and it was great to see John's research on the Quonset hut and to learn about its history. This is an aerial photograph of a view east from the ocean of Palisades Park in the foreground, looking down Santa Monica Boulevard in the center. Next. And this is our project site, the Bellevue that you might be familiar with, the 2-story building at the northeast corner of Ocean and Santa Monica on the right. Next slide. The outline of the site is in blue here, and then in red are the 2 landmark buildings, the 1926 Spanish Colonial Revival mixed-use building on the right, and the 1906 Queen Anne building on the left. Just off our site and to the north is the landmark Gussie Moran House. You can even see the Mar Vista apartments in the upper left of this image. Downtown Santa Monica was changing dramatically in the late 1920s from a single-family residential neighborhood to incorporate multifamily retail and office projects. And this really does describe that history well, as will the project that is developed here in the future. We started to look at these aerial photographs and we noticed that the Queen Anne, as you'll see, has been altered over time, but it had a widow's walk. Next slide. This was a remarkable find for me. I was scrolling on eBay one day, looking for historic photographs in Santa Monica, and stumbled upon this real picture postcard, as they're called. People in turn of the century California didn't have ready access to cameras. We didn't carry them in our pockets like we do today. Typically people would commission a photograph of their house. So this is a postcard of that photograph, and you can see on the right through the leaves of the eucalyptus tree that widow's walk and tower. And this was the project that we were working on. I couldn't leap up fast enough to buy this photograph, this postcard on eBay. Next. This is the front of that postcard, and I'll just read the first line. It says, this is the front photo of our house looking out southwest on the Pacific. I mean, it's just amazing. A postcard sent from this property on Ocean Avenue to a friend or relative in Illinois. Next. So this is how the building has been handed down to us. One of the first survey photographs, I believe, from the 1970s. And you can see that there's been some alterations. The tower element was truncated. Now it has a conical shaped roof. The porch has been infilled. Next. And current image, pretty much the way it looked in the 1970s. So typical of single family development, the building is set back with an open space in front along the sidewalk. So times they've changed. There's an apartment building on the left, which wasn't identified as a historic resource. But all of these photographs help give us direction on a project that's as large as complex as this. Next. The building next door, the Spanish Colonial Revival mixed-use building, we stumbled upon photographs of this building as well. And this is my former associate, Olivia, receiving a pile, literally a pile of photographs, a family's scrapbook from Little Rock, Arkansas. They had first photocopied the images and sent them to the property address in Santa Monica, and the tenant shared them with the property owner. Next. So among the photographs, in addition to photographs of cars that they were clearly very proud of, you can see our 1906 Queen Anne and 1926 Spanish Colonial Revival in the upper two photographs. The Spanish Colonial Revival, as you'll see, was also altered over time. It lost much of its decorative cast stone and waste mold ornamentation, balusters on the second floor balconies. This sort of documentation gives us all the clues to rebuild those features in the future. Next. Again, an early photograph from survey, I believe in the 1980s. Next. And the way that building looks today. So it feels a little naked when you see the historic photographs and what rich detail it had. So these two buildings help describe that early history of downtown Santa Monica and Ocean Avenue in particular from a single family residential neighborhood. This represents the transition to retail mixed with housing. The first floor retail space is at grade and very close to the sidewalk, in contrast to the setback of the Queen Anne. And there were 4 apartments, 2 flats on each side of this landmark building. Next. We also used sandbar maps to document the history of the site. And again, the project site is outlined in blue, the 2 landmark buildings in red. Next. And you can see how that changes over time. That first image was approximately 1918. This is approximately 1950. The Shangri-La apartment hotel built in 1940 is shown on the left. And you can see now the Spanish Colonial Revival building placed close to the street along Ocean Avenue. Next. So working with Gehry partners, we did a documentation to develop 3-dimensional models of both of the landmark buildings. The Gussie Moran house is shown here as well to the north. One of the most creative things we did was, as you'll see, the 2 buildings get flipped. So the Spanish Colonial Revival will move to the north and the Queen Anne will move to the south. But these images start to document the resource as they currently sit. Next. So this is showing the landmark buildings flipped, which is something that came late in our process of collaborating with Gehry partners. But it's very exciting because it opens up the courtyards and allows for the new museum facility that we'll see in a minute. Next. So this will be a direct addition. Howard described on the Santa Monica proper hotel how there's a bridge connection, as I described, sort of kisses the building, this will be much more of an integration. So there's a glass lobby that connects the two buildings. The Widow's Walk Tower would be restored. The original single dormer on the south elevation of the Queen Anne would all be brought back based on historic documentation to what they were when the buildings were early and unaltered. So this is about a 40,000 square foot museum facility, and I'll mention a little bit more about what that use will be next. We worked with Frank Gehry himself in developing this model. We started to take the model apart. Many people know how Gehry Partners work, but you should know it's all done in model. These are their sketches. And we had one really quite fun session with the team, including Frank, and we literally took the model apart as it affects the museum facility. Next. So these are images of that model we were working with the day that we collaborated, and the two buildings were not flipped yet. Next. So this is that same model, and I love that that picture postcard, real picture postcard, is blown up as an 8.5 by 11 image and pasted to the side of the model. In this picture in the background is Jeff Worth, who's the project developer and one of Frank's partners. David is to the left. Next. So this is a section, a north-south section of the site, showing how the two landmark buildings in that lavender color on the north will be placed on top of a subterranean museum space with parking at a level below that. So 2 levels of subterranean work will be developed here. Next. In order to describe the relocation, and this is an intact relocation, dissimilar from the Quonset hut that was taken apart, which is a perfectly fine way of relocating a building according to the National Park Service's Moving Historic Buildings publication. But what we described in the EIR and what we will accomplish here is an intact move. The 2 wood frame buildings will be relocated elsewhere on site. Caissons will be put in for construction of subterranean space and parking. And the 2 historic buildings will be moved back on top of a new slab. Next. And this has been accomplished in even more complex ways. Most recently, one of my clients sent me this image from Jerusalem. This is near a public market. It's a stone building that they protected in a steel cage, and they're constructing subterranean, I suspect, parking or other uses below. Next. And just up the street from the shotgun house that Mario described is 2501 2nd Street, another project we're doing with Howard Lax, where we've done an intact move. This landmark cottage will be placed on top of a subterranean basement that contains a bedroom and other support spaces and 2 new units. But it's been up in the air for the last year or so, and it will soon, in the next couple of weeks, merge with the basement level. Next. So just a few more images of the project. On the interior, the Queen Anne will be museum store, and the Spanish Colonial Revival will be a gallery. Next. These are some images of how the interiors will be opened up. The interiors are not subject to review, so we've taken a bit of greater liberty with them. Next. These are views into the museum store. Next. And through the lobby with the principal large addition to the left. Next. And a view north. The first view was south. This is a view north, looking at the Spanish Colonial Revival. Next. Next. And a bit of a hyphen connection. This is typically what you see where a new building merges with a landmark building, and that is what is proposed here as well. Next. Again, Gehry Partners works a lot with models. They built a model of most of downtown. Next. And a very large scale model of the project. Next. And this is the detail of the museum facility with the Spanish colonial revival moved to the northern position, the Queen Anne moved to the southern position, the openness now of the courtyard adjacent to the hotel, and the museum facility and the hyphen between the two buildings. The sort of chain link elements that you see here will be developed much as Gehry Partners has developed the recent museum in Washington celebrating President Eisenhower. Next. And I mentioned at the beginning that the city council shown here in the recent, after the recent hearing, unanimously approved the project. The first time I've ever seen the city issue a press release. Frank is on the right in this image and Jeff Worth is in the background. There's still ways to go on this project. It will still go through design review by the Architectural Review Board for the majority of the project, and the two landmark buildings and museum facility will go through review by the Landmarks Commission. So we're not using the JDRB process that was used for the proper hotel. And I believe next slide, I think that's it. That's Frank presenting. And next slide. So thank you, and back to Libby.
Wow, exciting stuff. Thank you, Robert. And thank you to all of our panelists. It's been a very interesting hour and some minutes. Now I think we have time for some questions, and we have questions that I'll get right to it. And I'll try to direct it to the person that I think would be the one that they want to answer. The first one has to do with the Quonset hut, and John, this is for you. This person wants to know why the other Quonset structure was not given landmark status.
Libby, I could answer that question.
Okay, would you actually, John actually talked about it too, but
He did.
why don't you just reiterate what he said?
Yeah, I was on the Landmarks Commission when this came up for designation, and the reason was basically one was more intact and the other one had been chopped up quite a bit. So the one that had been heavily altered was not considered to have enough material integrity to meet the standards for landmarking, but the other one did, and that's why that one was selected for landmark status.
Thank you, thank you. The next question is, how many shotgun, Mario, there's a couple of shotgun questions, so stand by. How many shotgun structures still exist in Santa Monica? Are all the existing shotgun structures landmarked?
No, this is the only intact one, the one we have. There's about 6 others that we have found, but they're so kludged on and they've been, so altered. Like one has a big garage stuck on the front of it instead of a porch, which was the traditional element for hot weather. And so they've been so altered that they've lost their historical integrity. This is the best model that we could find, and that's the one that got preserved, fortunately.
Okay, Mario, hang on. There's just a couple of quick answers for you. Where was the kitchen and bathroom in the shotgun house?
The kitchen and bathroom were in the back, all the way on the back of the house. And the kitchen was added first, and then the bathroom was added on the side when they got running water.
Okay. Also, another question is the floor original?
Well, that's a good question. There is an original floor from 1897 underneath a quote unquote new floor that's 80 years old that was laid in 1943 because we found a newspaper between the two floors that precisely dated the oak floor that you walk on today. So it's original, but it's new.
Okay, great, thank you. And staying with housing, John, there's one more question for you. While we know that nowadays the Quonset huts have air conditioning and all that, but how did you do climate control in the 40s? It seemed like with a steel box, it could be pretty darn hot or freezing.
You know what? I always assumed that they were all hot tin cans. I mean, but then when you read about them, and I think especially in Alaska, I mean, they were burning fossil fuels, so I think they were burning a lot of oil. But there's some documentation that they're really quite snug. They're all tidy and snug. So, and they actually had different foundations for the different climates. So when they brought them to the tropics, they actually raised them up off the ground so they get under airflow. And they are actually arranged like a shotgun. You can have an opening at the back and opening at the front. So they did do some site-specific things for them, but you never hear about them being complained about. But I think that's because no one even knew what air conditioning was. So they just thought, it's hot, it's hot. In Alaska, they just turned the oven up. So
Thank you. Robert, do you know what the use will be of the project before you engage in it? And a second part of that is, are there projects that you just don't have enough historic documentation, so you can't go forward with it?
Well, very often we would very much like for the building to tell us what it wants to be. So we don't always have that luxury, but typically the least amount of intervention is best. So if it could be reused for the original purpose, that would be our first goal. But we're here today talking about changes in use that are appropriate, so that involve minimal change. So with respect to research, first of all, we have the physical documentation, as Mario just described. There was evidence that there was the original floor, and that the beneath the current hardwood floor, and the evidence was that there was a newspaper between them. So we're always finding new information. Sometimes we call it unforeseen circumstances, but we're finding new information through the course of a project. We do an exhaustive amount of research to document what we can. And sometimes the gods smile on us and deliver just when we need them, photographs and other documentation. So you have to look for these things. They don't always readily appear. They're not always stuffed into a closet, but we look in the closets as well.
Thank you, Robert. This person, a gentleman, are there other new adaptive reuse projects in the planning stage in Santa Monica? Is there a list of these projects? Is the city of Santa Monica accommodating to approving these projects? Any special significance to the name proper? My goodness. Okay, and is there an operator for the new museum? Great presentation, very interesting. So let's take this. I don't know. I don't know who could answer that. The fact is, are there plans for ongoing adaptive reuse projects in Santa Monica? Is that something? I know, Howard, you're involved with that other Clabbered House on 2nd Street. Is that one of several that you are doing, or is that just one?
Yes. Yeah, both Robert, Chad, and I are working on 3 adaptive reuse projects at this time: on Ocean Avenue, on 7th Street, and of course the one that you saw in Robert's presentation on 2nd Street as well too.
I have a comment on that. I think a lot of them, the ones we reviewed today, were all historically significant in some way. There's a lot of buildings. I'm looking at a project right now on the promenade that's a commercial building. They're looking to turn it into residential. But that's totally under the radar. It's not a building anyone really cares about. The city won't even know about it until it gets brought in for permits, and then it just becomes a plan check thing. So a lot of adaptive reuse could be under the radar and not necessarily historically significant.
That's correct. That's exactly right. So there are most likely many more projects that will be identified as historic. And of course, at that time, they will most likely be adaptive reuse in the future.
And I-
Thank you. Go ahead, John.
I'm pleased to say a little something more about the museum because I intended to. And
There's
it will
actually
be
a question.
it will be a museum of art and architecture, and it will feature the work of Frank Gehry. The developer, Jeff Worth, has purchased Frank's archive after 1980. So that will be available for the museum. The Getty owns Frank's archive to 1980. So I suspect that whatever is done there will be in frequent partnership with the Getty, which is all good. I think having a museum of art and architecture, as Frank said, architects are artists. I think that it will be a world-class facility. It will likely be run by a nonprofit organization yet to be formed. But I don't believe there's anything else like it in the United States. There is a similar facility in Montreal, the Centre Canadien d'Architecture. But this is a unique opportunity really for Santa Monica to celebrate historic preservation and architecture.
Thank you. We're saving the last question for the big elephant in the room, which it has to do with housing. The state has mandated that Santa Monica add 8,000 new units of affordable housing. This is directed to Mario. Do you know if the city is looking at local buildings that may be adaptively reused for this new purpose? Another adjunct question had to do with the parking structures that are being demolished, and want to know if that's useful for adaptive reuse for housing. Mario, you want to tackle that one?
Sure. So following up what John's talked about, I think some of that housing will be inserted into existing buildings. Some of them that maybe are not very dramatic, but they're still, you're preserving the outer feeling of the building and the scale and the massing and things like that. But to create those kinds of numbers, 9,000 new units, of which 6,000 have to be affordable according to the state, it's going to take some massive amount of demolition. There's just no question about that, unfortunately. The urban fabric will change substantially, particularly along the boulevards, which is where a lot of these buildings are headed. The boulevards will look much different. When you drive down a street, boulevard in Santa Monica, it's often 2 stories, 1 story. You know, it's a very low-rise. We still are a substantially low-rise city, obviously with some nodes like downtown. But now those nodes are going to be proliferating down all of our boulevards. And obviously at Bergamot Station, that's going to be a big node because that's where the transit stop is.
Thank you.
If I could, Libby, I would just
yes,
add, in Los Angeles, there is an adaptive reuse ordinance, and adaptive reuse in Los Angeles means conversion of commercial or industrial space to housing. That's what it means. It doesn't mean commercial adaptive reuse. It means residential adaptive reuse. And there are significant incentives, including the total elimination of parking, which is now at least soon going to be allowed in most areas by state law, but it doesn't require new parking. It does require seismic retrofit, but it's for buildings that are historic and non-historic, new and old. And I would hope that we're going to see the conversion of recently constructed commercial office buildings converted to housing. I think is probably the largest pool of available projects for adaptive reuse.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks all of you. And now I would like to, we got to end this. So we are going to invite the president of the Santa Monica Conservancy, Tom Clays, to welcome you and to give some final comments. Tom?
Thank you, everybody. First off, I wanted to thank the speakers here, John Arnold, Robert Chattel, Howard Lax, Mario Fonda-Bonardi, and Ruthann Lehrer for all their input here. You can imagine that all they had to say today took a lot of effort to put together the presentation. So I want to thank you guys very much. And I want to thank the owners of the property who obviously were behind in agreement with presenting these projects. NMS Housing originally for the Pono Burger site, EAH Housing, the Nikkei project, Jeff Worth and Worth Real Estate on Ocean Avenue, Core Group and Proper Hospitality for the Proper Hotel. The Conservancy manages the Shotgun House and it's owned by the city, but we did all the work on it and Ruthann spoke to a bunch of others. So I want to thank all of you for the immense amount of work that you guys put into this presentation. It was absolutely wonderful. I also want to acknowledge somebody else who's not on screen and did not speak today, and that's Cheryl Kushner. She was been pushing for the last couple years about the concept of adaptive reuse and doing a tour. And what happened this last year is the tour became this webinar, and we expect to have a tour next year. So I just want to acknowledge Cheryl for her incredible amount of work on identifying properties throughout the city. Many of them were spoken to about the speakers from the speakers tonight. So thank you, Cheryl. I want to thank the program committee and the co-chairs, Steve Loper and Libby Motika, who produced today's program, and the rest of the program committee members who contributed to this, and other they contribute to all our conservancy programs. So thank you to the whole program committee, in particular Libby and Steve. And finally, to our Zoom administrator who's behind the scenes here, Adina Berheimer, and Catherine Azimi, our communications coordinator, who helped a lot in the program. Now I want to extend a special thanks to our Business Leadership Circle members. We have a number of new Leadership Circle members this year, and we hope to grow that group along with all our supporters of the Conservancy. You can see many of their logos and names here, and I thank you very much for all your support. And also note here that the recording here will be posted of this talk today. Will be posted on YouTube, and watch out for an email from us on Tuesday or Wednesday about a link. Okay. Now, finally, I just want to mention this program is the beginning of a series of events focusing on the concept of adaptive reuse. For preservation to be a viable part of our business and our world and our lives, to preserve all these buildings, we must be open to adapting historic structures so they can be useful to our community for many decades to come. Only so many of our buildings can retain their original use. You can't keep every building that's historic, and users change. So adaptive reuse is absolutely critical and something preservation full-heartedly embraces. We plan on having a tour of adaptive reuse buildings here this upcoming year, so watch out for that. And we hopefully will be using this concept of adaptive reuse as a theme for many programs into the future. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. The Conservancy, 20 years old this year, beginning in August. We've accomplished a lot in the last 20 years from our numerous education programs and tours, our annual awards, which recognize exemplary preservation projects, our efforts to work with the city and the community to improve preservation policies and funding, and much, much more. But there's so much more for us to do. We hope you all support the Conservancy. If you do already, that's awesome. We really appreciate it with your membership and donations. If you have not yet contributed, please consider going to our website, which is www.smconservancy.org, and click on support us. And there's opportunities there to donate or become members. And finally, please watch out for our viewers survey. It should be coming up on Tuesday regarding today's program. The survey should only take a couple minutes, and getting your feedback really helps us in creating quality programs that are valuable to you and the community going forward. So please look out for that. And with that, I just want to thank you for attending tonight, and have a great evening and week coming up. Good evening.
When trumpets were mellow and every gal only had one fellow, no need to remember when, 'cause everything old is new again. Dancing at your Long Island Jazz Age parties. Waiter, bring some more Bacardis. We'll order now what they ordered then, 'cause everything old is new again. Get out your white suit, your tap shoes and tails. Let's go backwards when forward fails. And movie stars you thought were long dead now are framed beside your bed. Don't throw the past away.